Amnesti Internasional didirikan oleh seorang pengacara di London. Pada awal terbentuk, organisasi ini telah berkampanye untuk membebaskan lebih dari 10.000 tahanan politik dalam 5 dekade. Saat ini organisasi internasional tersebut berkembang menjadi gerakan yang mendunia dengan anggota sebanyak 7 juta orang di 100 negara. Salil Shetty merupakan sekretaris jenderal Amnesti Internasional. Ia lahir dan dibesarkan di Bangalore, India. Kedua orang tua Salil merupakan aktivis hak asasi manusia.
I grew up at a time when civil liberties were at risk in India. We had Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, who had suspended all civil political rights in 1976. So I grew up as a student fighting for human rights. That challenge continues in a large and complex country like Indonesia or India. Human rights is always, facing big challenges. So I think it shaped me very much.
Salil menilai bahwa kondisi hak asasi manusia di seluruh dunia kian memburuk. Banyak pemimpin negara di dunia saat ini menyalahgunakan kekuasaan dan mengabaikan hak warga negaranya.
We have recently released Amnesty International's annual report, which is the state of the world's human rights report, really. And what we've said in that report is that the last 1 year has been a very challenging year for human rights, and mainly because we have many political leaders who have used politics of hate and fear to divide societies into us versus them by scapegoating some people and using that scapegoating to get political power.
Tidak hanya di negara berkembang, Salil menilai pelanggaran hak asasi yang serius saat ini banyak terjadi di negara maju, seperti Amerika Serikat dan belahan benua Eropa. Hal ini mengindikasikan kesejahteraan manusia saat ini tengah berada di level kritis. Untuk itu, Salil giat melakukan kampanye serta mengimbau masyarakat dunia untuk aktif dalam proses penegakan hak asasi manusia. Nadia Laras, Ariesta, Jakarta.
Amnesty International adalah sebuah organisasi yang memperjuangkan hak asasi manusia, dan sejak didirikannya lebih dari 50 tahun, Amnesty International telah memperjuangkan HAM di berbagai negara di seluruh dunia. Dan apa-apa saja yang diperjuangkannya, contohnya adalah misalnya para tahanan yang dianiaya atau mereka yang ternyata tidak memiliki atau mendapatkan keadilan, dan juga yang hak asasi manusianya dirampas, hak ekspresinya dan terdiskriminasi. Nah, bagaimana Amnesty International menghadapi berbagai macam masalah yang sekarang ada di dunia, misalnya konflik, diskriminasi, intoleransi, dan juga kekerasan yang berlangsung. Kita akan berbincang dengan Sekjen dari Amnesty International, Salil Shetty, dan mereka akan segera membuka kantor di Indonesia. Hello, Salil.
Hello, Desi.
It's good to see you here in Jakarta, Indonesia. Of course, you're not a stranger to Indonesia, but this time you've come with a mission, which is to open an office in Indonesia. Why now, and what do you hope to get out of having an office here?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me on the show, and thanks to CNN and your audience. I think you're well aware, and your viewers are well aware, that the last years have been very challenging globally for human rights. We've seen a real demonization in the political sphere of minorities, of refugees, of migrants. I mean, 2016, in our State of the World's annual human rights report, we've declared it as one of the worst years in recent times. I mean, if you take something like the refugee question, the world has never seen this kind of a refugee crisis since the Second World War. But 36 countries in our documentation showed that they actually pushed people back into countries where they were at risk. The refugees who were fleeing from war and persecution were pushed back to where they came from. And this is a very cardinal principle of refugee, respect for refugee rights, what is called non-refoulement, that you cannot send somebody back to a country they're at risk, including countries like Australia, in the neighborhood, who send people back. Secondly, if you take something like war crimes, because even a few years ago, we would not have accepted the bombing of hospitals, of schools, of even funeral processions. In the last year alone, we documented 23 countries who have committed war crimes. So it's not a good time for human rights. And in this game of demonization, which we are seeing, of course, Trump is the most visible sort of example of this. But it's
not just
some
of his, like-minded leaders in Europe.
Yeah. So you see Wilders, for example, in Holland, or now the French elections, Le Pen. But it's also, Erdogan in Turkey, or Duterte in Philippines. Yeah. So and this, I'm painting this picture to answer your question, because in this whole demonization process on the global stage, there is a kind of very unfortunate conflation that refugees are mostly Muslims, terrorists are mostly Muslims, and because the only way these people get to power is by demonizing the other. It's a politics of division, of hate, scapegoating. So, and they've been very successful at doing this. So here comes the role of Indonesia, because it's the single largest Muslim country in the world. By the way, I come from the second largest Muslim country in the world, which is India. So I understand a lot of the challenges that Indonesia faces. But I really feel that it's time for Indonesia to speak up, to really challenge this discourse, this kind of dominant discourse which is created by Western media, by Western powers, that conflates Islam with an anti-human rights kind of discourse. So I think Indonesia needs to speak up a lot more. But in order for Indonesia to speak up with credibility, it also needs to shape up internally, to make sure that its own record is clean. So that's why we believe that having a ground presence in Indonesia is very important at this point in time, because Indonesia can play a much bigger role in ASEAN, in the G20, on the global stage. But it needs to shape up internally.
Yes, and I think a lot of Indonesians were very well aware of that. For a long time we were under the New Order regime, where a lot of the human rights were violated, and we're still sort of have not resolved some of those issues. Now, let's just focus on Indonesia at the moment, and the kind of things that Indonesia need to do to step up, as it were, to improve, especially when it comes to dealing with past atrocities. There's still a lot of unfinished business here in Indonesia. What would you say that Amnesty International would like to see Indonesia focus on, particularly, and how does it work with having Amnesty International as partner?
I think the one thing it might be helpful to preface my comments with is that, and most of your viewers may not even be aware of this, is that Amnesty International is quite unique. On the one hand, we're an NGO. On the other hand, we are a people's movement. We are made up of more than 7 million ordinary people, and our belief is that ordinary people coming together can create extraordinary change. So, which means that we take no money from governments or corporations for our research, our campaigning. We are independent, impartial. We have no political ideology, religious.
But your funding mainly comes from individuals, contributions.
Individuals, yeah, but no governments, no institutional bias, no religious, political. So we speak truth to power. So whatever I say about the Indonesian government kind of comes from a position where we say the same thing. In fact, you may have seen just in the last few days, the Mosul attacks by the US coalition has resulted, in our view, on massive loss of civilian lives. So we speak up, we expose the American brutality on essentially Sunni Muslims in Iraq right now, Syria right now, Iraq right now. This is what's going on. But so coming back to your question as to on the issue of accountability for past abuses, where do we stand? Now, my view is that Indonesia is carrying a very heavy burden of the past, a painful legacy of the past, and opening up those wounds is never easy. But I'm not sure that Indonesia can move forward faster without finding justice for the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are waiting for justice for a long time. 1965, yes. 1966, we're talking about 500,000 or 1 million people killed. If you take the 1998 riots, people are waiting for justice from that.
The disappearance of Munir.
Munir, it's now 12 years, I think. We are talking about a lot of people Munir is, of course, an iconic disappearance, but if you take what's happened in the conflicts in Aceh, Papua, ongoing issues in Papua, a lot of them are unsung heroes, and And this is painful to open up these questions, but it's, people have waited a long time. There have been kind of fits and starts, even the new president, Jokowi, has made some statements saying, let's find resolution.
Because it has proven to be very, very sensitive, not just on the government level, but on the people's level as well. There's a lot of, constant
it's
dialogue.
Never easy. It's never easy, but, our experience internationally is that the only road to sustained peace, sustained development, sustained economic growth, which Jokowi is so keen on, is through justice. And reconciliation is good. There's a proposal to have a national harmony bill, non-judicial mechanisms, all of that is good, but that can't be a substitute.
But are we on the right track on those matters? Because the government has, it is part of the Jokowi government's, promise to make sure that.
Yeah, we were very excited at the Navachita, that he talked about these issues, but the action is, not matching with the. So, they held a symposium. There have been so many statements from different ministers, but in fact, what is the bottom line? The bottom line is, decades later, not a single military or security force official has been convicted. So you have, Contras HAM have done, Komnas HAM have done a lot of investigations. The brutality is shocking that they have exposed, but the, AG's office
still
doesn't take
it in the back burner now.
Yeah. And the AG's office has not investigated one single. So at the end of the day, it shows a culture of impunity, and this culture of impunity does not affect only the past. It affects today, it affects the future.
But do you think having an office here in Indonesia will help address some of those issues? I mean, will this be a focus for Amnesty International in Indonesia, and will it say work together with Komnas HAM, with the National Commission on Human Rights?
As you know, Amnesty is one of the first internationally to raise our voice against the authoritarian regimes and their abuses. So we hope to work more closely, but the great thing about Indonesia is, you also have a very dynamic civil society and NGOs and activists, human rights defenders. So we only want to build on their work, we want to work with them. But yeah, at the end of the day, for us, what's important is that the victims, I joined some of them on this Thursday in front of the presidential palace. I think it's over 450 weeks or so that they have been meeting there, mothers, family members. And this has gone on for too long, and so we need a truth and reconciliation bill. We need a criminal code reform and a penal code, criminal procedure code reform to remove all the ambiguities. It's very hazy in this country to figure out even what is a clear human rights violation, and all of these have to be in line with international standards. So because the good thing about Indonesia is that it's a signatory to many of the international human rights conventions and treaties, but a lot of the laws and practices are not consistent with even something as basic as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
So Amnesty International will be breathing down the neck of the government, and then of course, Indonesia, we still have the death penalty, and very recently the Jokowi government has been very, very sort of quite aggressive in actually carrying out some of these executions. Your thoughts? Is this something that Amnesty International in Indonesia will focus on, trying to at least get a moratorium on the death penalty?
President Jokowi came with a lot of hope, because if you look at his election campaign promises and commitments, there was a lot of stuff which was in there about respecting human rights and lifting things to a different level. And he's done some positive things. It's very important to acknowledge those things. For example, he released some key political prisoners like Felipe Karma from Papua. Amnesty campaigned for a long time for his release. He's promised to release more. That hasn't happened, but that's a good start. If you take the presidential declaration on refugees and asylum seekers, that clarified the legal status. He recognized the community forest ownership of indigenous communities.
And that's a breakthrough, because it's
that's good.
A long time
so but the thing about him is it's kind of stop start, hot cold. You can't really figure out whether this is part of an overall plan, or he has to constantly kind of make sure his political base is intact. And human rights is a tricky one, because it's a little bit black or white. You can't say a little bit of torture is okay. It's either okay or not okay, and so stop start, hot cold is difficult. So death penalty, your question was on death penalty. Yeah, I think this is just, Amnesty's position is very clear. We are against death penalty under all circumstances for all crimes, because we think that it's fundamentally against the right to life, and therefore it's a medieval practice. Even practiced by the United States, by the way. So,
and it hasn't been proven to be effective in discouraging crime.
This is the 40th year that Amnesty International is campaigning against death penalty globally, and we are one of the loudest voices. When we started campaigning against death penalty, there were only about 30 countries who were not using death penalty. Today, it's only about 30 countries who are still using it. So, Indonesia is on the wrong side of history on the death penalty use. As you said, it's wrong inherently, but it's not even a deterrent. The idea that it has a deterrent effect on drug crimes is just factually not borne out. I mean, if you take the narcotics report of the government of Indonesia itself, after the 18 executions which Jokowi sanctioned, which is the highest, I think in the entire period of democratic history of this country, it's been mostly moratoriums that have been used in this country. Very few executions have happened. So this was really shocking. Or you take Duterte, yes. He's killed 2,000 people in the last few months.
Which brings us to the point, so do you think the death penalty for drug criminals, it doesn't work, it's completely wrong?
There's no evidence globally to show that it works, because, and there's other things about counterterrorism, right? I mean, I've never heard of a terrorist who says, I'm not going to blow up something because I might have death penalty, because it just doesn't make any sense. So, and it's even more risky in a place where, like Indonesia, where the criminal justice system itself is, has its weaknesses. So you get it wrong, you execute somebody, there's no coming back, right? I mean, and think about all the Indonesians who are in death row in other countries abroad. Over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of campaigning from the Indonesian government to commute their death penalty into life sentences. Now, fortunately, there is some discussion on the criminal code to move it to life imprisonment. Amnesty feels that the first step is that they should be moved towards a moratorium and then move towards abolition. The interesting thing about death penalty anywhere in the world is that it cannot be a decision made by referendum, because the general public, it depends on how you present the case to them. So at the end of the day, it's a leadership decision, and I feel Jokowi should make that decision. And because it also, the international reputation of Indonesia, unfortunately, this one issue has set it back so far. It's very, very unfortunate.
But what about mass murderers and terrorism? Where does Amnesty International stand with that? Because I know in some of the developed countries, the death penalty is still being used as a punishment for terrorist mass murderers.
Europe is
killed.
Except for Belarus, Europe has eliminated death penalty completely. Australia, in all the developed, the only exception in the so-called developed world is the United States, and that's mostly.
And it's not being a very good example at the moment for human rights.
Exactly, and you have Donald Trump has said all sorts of strange things. He thinks that Guantanamo should be expanded. There should be more people there. He even said that torture he thinks is a good thing, but General Mattis had told him that may not work very well, so he's let it be. So, but he says different things every day. We can't go on that basis. So, but I think as far as Indonesia is concerned, given its generally strong stand on human rights, death penalty presents a kind of a jarring note to that.
Salil, do you have any sort of like a blueprint of what you would like to see Amnesty International in Indonesia achieve, 3 to 5 years from now? And is there sort of wish list or priorities?
You listed two key ones. One is the accountability for past abuses, which, by the way, merges into impunity for current abuses. As I said, somehow when we think about accountability for past abuses, we think of the past, but actually impunity is a pervasive culture. Once you say that those who are in very serious high-level positions of power, particularly from the, and it's not the institution of the army, it's individuals who are getting away with this, and we know that many of them are at very high positions of power. So once you say that if you're in power, the rule of law doesn't apply to you, then you're in a very shaky position. And because
we're still inheriting the same, basically, individuals and the same. It's still too recent, perhaps, for Indonesia to be able to deal effectively with these.
But this is it. You see, it's countries who have embraced this reality and addressed it. South Africa is one of them, but there are others, who've said that it's painful, but let's find ways out of it. So that's the one issue, and yes, the death penalty issue. But I'm not even talking about the ongoing challenges, because we still have, unlawful detentions, you still have attacks on the press, for example, in Papua. The other major issue on which I gave a talk in Jakarta just a few days ago is the issue of religious tolerance. And I started with that when we began this conversation, that I think Indonesia has a very important role to play on the global and ASEAN stage on this. But it has to get its own domestic house in order. So we have seen now in the last, and this is the overall picture, that if you take the history of Indonesia, recent history of Indonesia, there's been much to celebrate, right? I mean, the democratic transition was smooth, peaceful, institutions are in place, civil society is strong, you have a relatively independent media, excluding Papua for now. But then, like, if you look at the reforms which have come in, they have faltered. Security sector reform has faltered. You now have a judiciary which is accused of corruption, which has lost some of its, gloss. But the big question really is about religious tolerance. Now, this country is known for its pluralism, for its religious. I grew up in school in India, given the links between Nehru in my country and your leaders here, Sukarno, etc. We grew up with the Panchashila, we grew up with unity and diversity, and we always looked at Indonesia as a model, even from India. And now in the last, you just look at what's happening with the Ahmadiyya situation. I mean, 12 years later, the community is displaced. Not a single perpetrator has been brought to justice. Look at the Shias, and that's 4 or 5 years since they've been displaced. I mean, the Ahmadiyyas from Lombok, the Shia from Sampang, you know the history of these stories, but it keeps going on. Most recently of the Ghafatar case, right? So the use of blasphemy law, the new joint ministerial decree, which is against this Milia Abraham sect. You can't say that there can be one law for one community and another law for, because if you respect freedom of religion, even if you don't agree with what those people are talking about, you have to respect them. You take the case of the Supreme Court ruling, which is very clear that the churches, the places of worship in, not far from here, in Bekasi, Bogor, we have a Supreme Court ruling, but the local rulers, the local administration says, no, you can't go ahead. I mean, the use of Sharia law. Last year, we had a case of a 60-year-old Christian grandmother who was caned, accused of selling alcohol. Just this month, we had 2 Buddhist men caned for accusation of gambling. I mean, these are like, it just doesn't add up. So this is the other big focus for our work. We're hoping that, the whole issue of freedom of expression, freedom of religion is something that this government can act on.
How will you do your work? I mean, you mentioned religious intolerance, and we are seeing it. But under the New Order period, for example, it's easy to suppress some of these things, and people basically not allowed to express whether it's any kind of intolerance, any kind of dissent or activities that create sort of friction in society. But the dark side of democracy is that it brings up all sorts of all the differences in opinions, and unfortunately, fortunately, I mean, whichever way you see it, Indonesia is a very pluralistic society. We're very heterogeneous, and a lot of these things actually come from the grassroots up, and this appeal to populism, which is Indonesia being a democracy, is now being used by political leaders to capitalize on in order to get elected. So how will Amnesty International, because a lot of it is also, some people maybe think that yes, there shouldn't be as many churches built, or they should be some of the minority religions are not welcome. I mean, this is the kind of thing that
diversity, the beauty of diversity, the beauty of pluralism, the beauty of democracy is that it's 1,000 flowers bloom when it comes to freedom of expression. So nobody is suggesting that people can't have views, of course, and in fact our view is the whole blasphemy law. See, the blasphemy law in the last year or so, 10 cases, 2 years I think, 10 cases of blasphemy law, what we are calling abuse, has happened. And now that's like letting loose a tiger. Once you were riding a tiger, you can't control it. Now it's been used against Governor Ahok himself. So it was used against some opposition leaders, now like Ghafatar, all those cases.
Yes, because
now,
these are easy political subjects to capitalize on.
So if your question is, how do we manage this complexity of, the kind of Tower of Babel, so to speak, I mean, so the question is not about what individuals' views are, the question is what is the state response to this. So if you have a Supreme Court ruling, so, I asked the Minister of Religious Affairs about why that after 12 years the Ahmadiyya, or after 4 years the Shias have not been given,
and his response?
Yeah, so obviously they should be returned to their original place, or at least given alternative adequate housing and with proper consultation. So his response, which we know of course, is that the local administration or even the local community don't want them there. There's a risk of public order being somehow disrupted. But that's where the state comes in, right? I mean, why do we have a government then if it's not to establish the rule of law? I'm not suggesting that you bulldoze your way through. It's good that they're having some talks and mediation, etc. But talks and mediation is not a substitute for rule of law, whether it comes for accountability of past abuses or in the case of freedom of religion and religious tolerance. At the end of the day, for those who are minorities, because you cannot say that when the Westerners are attacking Islam, that there should be rule of law there, and when it comes to our own house. I have spent a lot of time in Iraq, for example, arguing with Prime Minister Abadi, who is the Prime Minister of Iraq, that the protection of Sunnis is so important in a moment when the Shias are dominating the country. We have to have the same rule here. I mean, Shias are a minority, but you have to respect that. That is what a modern state is about, and that's the struggle. And I'm not suggesting it's easy, but the question is, what is the signaling from the highest levels? Is it to appease? You have almost 1 million people on the streets coming out here just a couple of months ago. So once you start, allowing the tiger to ride you, then there's a point at which you can't control it.
Yes, it's a bit like, putting it to the referendum, and we've seen what happens when in the UK, Brexit, you leave it to the people to start making these decisions, and you end up with results that's not actually good for the country. But then how, going back to my question, so how does Amnesty International will do its work and making sure that some of these
in a
targets...
sense, I'm glad you asked the question, because in a sense it's good to explain the methodology of how Amnesty works. So first and foremost, probably what is very unique about Amnesty is that everything we do is evidence-based, because everything we say is always contested, because we are asking hard questions of accountability of those in power. So it will always be contested. We understand that. So the research, the investigation, to make sure that our documentation and facts are very accurate is very crucial. So the first piece of our work is evidence gathering. We do it ourselves. We don't rely on secondary data. We have trained researchers who spend sometimes an Amnesty, for example, our next report on Papua is coming out in July this year. That would have taken years to prepare, because we are very careful, making sure that all are cross-checked, everything is. We also show the draft of the findings to the government normally, or whoever we are talking about, so that they can't contest it later on. So that's the first piece, the research. The second piece is then to use the evidence to campaign, and the campaigning is both with the general public and through the media, because media is very important for us. And then of course we do a lot of one-to-one lobbying. We don't go into the public domain if we can resolve it, through a direct conversation, because our first preference is always to talk to the government authorities and deal with this. And the other part, which is kind of touches on your question as to how do we deal with the public kind of debate on these questions, the fact that there is a societal divided view on these questions, and that's what we call human rights education, because in Europe, in North America, etc., there is no school, no university where there is no Amnesty club or group, because people grow up with Amnesty and human rights in those countries. And coming from India, from the south myself, I have been totally passionate in my last 6 years in Amnesty to build Amnesty's base in the countries where we have a lot of human rights challenges. So it has to be a mass movement. Amnesty is a membership-based movement. So I do hope that your viewers will be inspired by what Amnesty does. We now have a amnesty.indonesia.org website as well. You can join, become a member, and hopefully also contribute. That's the other thing. I'm very keen that and we already achieved some of this in some countries, that Amnesty's funding inside the country is domestically raised from the people of the country. That gives it a legitimacy and rootedness, which is very important.
Tell me some of the recent victories, so to speak, or successes that Amnesty International has achieved globally?
I mean, I was saying that just opening the newspaper today, I was really happy to see that the US General himself has said that, yes, there is a case for the Mosul bombings to be investigated, that possibly the US forces have been involved in civilian deaths. I mean, this is like fresh in my mind, it's today, but I mentioned death penalty, which is one of Amnesty's big success stories. We're down to only about 30 countries still using execution. It was 30 countries who were not using it when we started. But political prisoners, we've had a lot of prisoners of conscience released, and some of our prisoners of conscience are very iconic, and I want to raise this iconic prisoners of conscience question because of the situation in Myanmar, where Aung San Suu Kyi, was one of Amnesty's kind of big success stories in some ways. I mean, it's not
been proven quite disappointing when it comes to the treatment with
now the Rohingya question is very disappointing in terms of Aung San Suu Kyi's own response. But I'm also raising this in the context of the role of Indonesia, and I know the foreign minister has been made several trips, and they're doing sort of quiet diplomacy, and they've provided some humanitarian aid, they're talking to the Bangladesh government. It's all good, but I would have expected Indonesia to play a much more sort of assertive leadership role and accept a lot more Rohingyas as refugees here, because
any particular examples what Indonesia should do more of, because I know that the foreign minister has been trying to come up with some statements against
So I mean, I think it's good for them to do the quiet stuff, but at the end of the day you also have to put some public pressure on the government, because I think Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, is herself doing a balancing act with the military, so she in a sense would need whatever support she can get publicly as well from key governments like Indonesia. But Indonesia has got accepted about 13 or 14,000 refugees, mostly Hazaras from Afghanistan, which is good. But given the global crisis, I believe that there should be much more global responsibility sharing, and Indonesia is well placed to accept many more.
And we're not seeing the same kind of willingness to share actually in the Middle East.
Yeah. I mean, you don't even have to go that far. I mean, look at the awful behavior of the Australian government. I mean, Australia has kind of been the pioneers in pushing boat people back into the water. Now Europe has learned from that methodology, and 5,000 people have already died this year in the waters.
Amnesty International, it's now been over 5 decades, and the world has changed a lot since then. We've seen more countries that have gone democratic, including Indonesia, for example. But then we've seen also different types of conflicts and violence going on. I mean, no more of this Cold War and the polarization between the capitalism, the communism, the East and West, but everything is sort of mingling. We have the people's movement, migration, refugee problems. We have intolerance and so on and so forth. So how has Amnesty International sort of changed the way that it's actually trying to deal with some of these exceedingly more complicated situations?
I think it's changed in multiple ways. First of all, what do we focus on has evolved over time, because when Amnesty started, it started mainly looking at the question of torture, and we won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1976 for the work we did against torture.
State-sponsored.
State-sponsored, yeah, fundamentally, and disappearances and authoritarian regimes. The new reality is that we have elected dictators. So we have to kind of find a way of dealing with the Dutertes and the Erdogans and the Trumps.
They're extremely popular.
Yeah, very popular. In fact, the more they abuse human rights, the more popular they become. At least with a segment of the population, because they're kind of very good propagandists as well. But over the years, one of the big shifts that Amnesty had to do was to look at economic social rights, because historically civil political rights, so economic social rights are things like poverty, education, health, also women's rights, because if you think about it, when we were dealing with political prisoners, torture, etc., most of them were men, because not many women were put in prison and tortured. But as our work in the developing countries grew, I think the voice of women became more and more important. So sexual and reproductive rights of women, women's empowerment, political participation, all of these voice has become much, much more important. And the indivisibility, and this is kind of the message also for President Jokowi, because I always find it very interesting when he says that, what Indonesia should focus on is economic development, infrastructure, roads. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have the human infrastructure, the human cohesion, the social cohesion, you're going to have no sustainable development.
You won't have a country at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, and of course you have to kind of, I mean, nobody is suggesting that growth is not important, but, and he knows better than anybody else that, you know, the two, economic social rights and civil political rights, are indivisible and interdependent. You know, that's what the Universal Declaration said, and it was not said for no reason. They are two sides of the same coin.
But you know, it's also a difference. We mentioned about the rise of the right wingers in Europe, and also, you know, the Trump phenomenon is actually because of their rhetorics, because of the things they say. We've seen an increasing number of people being, you know, discriminated, physically abused, assaulted, and I mean,
hate crimes are growing.
Hate crimes are growing. So how to deal with these things? Because it's no longer about dictators, you know, oppressing the people and torturing the prisoners, but it's about people on the street. You know, they're born there, they you know, think that they're part of the society, and then they find that they're actually outcast in their own country without the necessary
absolutely.
rights.
So I mean, I was saying that, you know, one is the topics on which we've had to focus have changed over time. And yeah, this whole issue of hate crimes, social discrimination has become more and more important, but also our methods have had to evolve, and that kind of links into your question now, because for example, the work we are doing now on schools and human rights education is much more intensified. The work we're doing in social media, Amnesty was historically a letter writing organization. We used to, schools and groups across the world used to write letters to release prisoners of conscience or political prisoners, and now we've had to really reinvent ourselves as also a digital organization, because that's where a lot of the discourse is happening, the debates are happening. We're not very good at it, we're still trying to get better, because we don't have the resources to do too much of that. But also, it's like the speed at which we're working. In the past we could take much longer to respond, but with you guys, the media, etc., 24/7, you're there, so we have to be there as well. So one of the things we've done is to what we're calling moving closer to the ground. We've moved our teams from sitting centrally in London to regional offices. So in Asia,
how's that working out? Is it actually much more efficient now? Much more?
I mean, it has its own challenges. It has, as you can imagine, if you're sitting in London, it's much safer, more comfortable, and you are more in before Brexit anyway.
Before Brexit, and before the attack in Westminster.
I mean, there's no place in that sense which is safe anymore in that sense. But no, but I mean, I think it's a very important, because also partly, we get more people from the region themselves being part of Amnesty, talking about, it's not like, people flying in from outside and giving a finger wagging at developing countries. I think that model is over. So for Asia, for example, we have offices in Hong Kong, Bangkok, the regional offices, Hong Kong, Bangkok, and in fact, I'm going to Colombo now. We'll open our South Asia office there, hopefully. So yeah, I think it'll be, we have a quicker response, we have a deeper relationship, we work hand in hand and stand with human rights defenders, those who are fighting for human rights. So
yeah, it's interesting with the social media and the digital world, so to speak. We've seen a lot of online activism from just about anybody, the change.org and others. I mean, people can now really do things and make a difference, and without actually belonging to an organization. Do you feel that the organization, Amnesty International, is still flexible, it's still quick, it's still efficient, or is it being sort of cumbersome?
The good thing is when people say, when people often tell me, that now there are so many organizations working on human rights. Amnesty is not the only one, and I say we need 1,000 more, 10,000 more of these organizations, because the challenges are so big. It's not a question of competing with other organizations or other, like online platforms, etc. Our competition is with those who are abusing human rights. That's our real competitor, and we welcome Change.org. In fact, Osman Hamid, who used to head Change.org previously in Contrast, is just starting as our national director for Indonesia. So, we will learn, we will collaborate. I mean, with
but
size,
funding these days? Is funding do you see sort of
like in some
donor
ways,
fatigue, which is
it's a very interesting situation. So, because our Twitter following, for example, in the United States increased from 1 million to 3 million in a matter of months. So we are in a very paradoxical situation that people see that in times like this, when human rights are at risk, Amnesty is seen as a go-to place. It is the reason why people come to Amnesty is because we are the only global human rights movement of people. We are not an institution in that sense. Please don't get me wrong, there's all sorts of internal challenges, large organizations have their own challenges, but I think Amnesty is, really fit for purpose. We made lots of internal changes, and we will learn and we evolve, and we have 7 million people standing behind us. That's not happening.
Is that growing in number?
It is growing, and it's also growing in the developing world, which is what excites me in the global south. Asia, Africa, Latin America is constantly growing. We did a big, annually we do something called Write for Rights, where people write letters to release prisoners. We just finished that. We almost have 4.8.
People don't write letters anymore.
No, it's either email or tweet or whatever, but it'll be actually calling for somebody's release. And we had 4.8 million people taking part. And this day and age, that level of engagement. I find young people are actually more involved, more engaged, more agitated, more outraged. And Amnesty provides an engagement vehicle for them.
But do you see the millennials getting a lot more energized when it comes to human rights issues as opposed to the older generation? They probably.
So the thing is that I think it's not like people don't work in kind of those categories of human rights, corruption, environment. They are not in favor of unaccountable leaders. They're angry with the system which doesn't deliver for them, and that anger needs to be channeled. What Amnesty does is it provides a structured way in which you can make a difference, because outrage is good, but I say engage is more important.
Where does the main part of your resource go to in this world, which is basically full
geographically
of all
or
yes, geographically? Yeah. What do you see as the main sort of hotspots now where human rights are violated on a daily basis? Of course, Syria and Yemen. We've seen parts of Africa.
As the media cycle is one thing, because obviously the cameras will go to Syria, and we have to be very conscious of not just following the cameras, because if you take a place like Sudan, which has been both Sudan and South Sudan, often they're forgotten. Now there's a famine, the cameras will go there now. Take the Democratic Republic of Congo, just talking about Africa. Yemen, forgotten crisis, but those are only the crisis and conflict countries. But there's ongoing issues of violence against women, of police brutality, of crushing of freedom of expression. You take a country like Egypt, or Turkey for that. We have the standing statement now that if you want to meet a journalist in Turkey, where do? You go to jail, because most of them are in jail now. So and we cannot take our eye off the underlying ongoing brutalities and human rights violations. So geographically, of course, the Middle East does consume a lot of our time and attention, but we are fairly evenly distributed. Europe, we thought that the problems in Europe are over, and here we are. You have a leader like Orban in Hungary. You have Wilders and Le Pen, we talked about, and the refugee crisis, the discrimination against the Roma people. So we are back into investing in Europe, which we thought was a done deal.
Yes, it doesn't paint like a very, it paints a sorry picture of the world. At least, what do you find in your research when it comes to trying to understand why these things are happening? And
No, I think there's many ways in which one can cut it, but I think that there's a combination of things happening. Firstly, there's too much of unaccountable leadership, both in government and the private sector. There's growing inequality, both within countries and across countries. So all this globalization conversation. And thirdly, institutions are failing us. The systems which whether it's a national government or the regional ASEAN type story, or you take something like the Security Council. The Security Council is a great example of a monumental failure in my view. It was set up by bringing the nuclear powers of the world to ensure peace and security in the world. and all they do is play politics. So, first of all, the 5 Security Council members, most of them are the biggest arms producers in the world. So, you would think that they actually have an incentive to increase conflicts, not reduce it. Any resolution that is coming to hold Israel accountable is vetoed by the United States. Any resolution to hold Assad in Syria accountable is vetoed by Russia and China. So, all they do is play politics. So, one of the calls we have made is that at least when it comes to atrocities like war crimes, international atrocities like genocide, all of these kind of extreme forms of atrocities, that the Security Council should voluntarily not use the veto, because the veto power is one of the most dangerous things which have been abused. So, that is one of the calls we are making. But yeah, I mean, if you ask me why are we in this situation, but I want us to make sure, I want to make sure that while it is true that there is a lot to be kind of negative about or gloomy about, it is also true that people mobilize. I mean, you take a look at the United States, for example. I have never seen young people in the US so mobilized politically to see change as it is happening now. And it is not a question of parties, because in fact, kids across the political divide are getting mobilized against injustice in many places, even in Europe. As the Wilders and the kind of so-called right-wing populists, so-called populists are growing in strength, equally the other side, of ordinary people saying, this is not in our name, this is not the UK we want, this is not the Europe we believe in. People are standing up. Africa, I mean, I don't know if you are even familiar with this small country, tiny country called the Gambia on the West African coast, just about 1 million people. For 30 years, there was a dictator ruling that place. Few months ago, that man was removed peacefully. And if anybody had told me that's possible, or even Myanmar, if you had told me a few years ago that there would be a transition of power in Myanmar, I would have said you're joking, because it was impossible. But there we are, things are moving, and the only solution lies in people being vigilant, organized, and holding their leaders accountable.
But Salil, how do you deal with extremely complex issues like Syria, fighting ISIS, protecting the Rohingyas and giving them back their rights? I mean,
all of these, in fact, the interesting pattern with all of these is that if you take Syria, or you didn't mention Boko Haram in Nigeria,
yes,
because
Boko
that's
Haram,
another one.
Yeah.
But if you think of what happened in northern Nigeria, what is the root of this conflict? If you look at northern Nigeria, it's been historically neglected. It's a Muslim majority part of the country, historically impoverished, politically neglected, economically neglected. The Boko Haram agitation started as a completely peaceful agitation. It was not violent. You may not agree with what Boko Haram was calling for, because it had a kind of excessive Islamic sort of extreme call, but leave alone that, it was peaceful. The agitation was peaceful. What happened in Aleppo in Syria? When Syrian the protests started, they were completely peaceful. So, typically what happens is genuine grievance, peaceful protest, you start attacking them using the military, using propaganda, and then people lose their head. And so, once you use excessive force, which is what we are saying, if you take the situation in Papua now, Amnesty doesn't have a view on self-determination, on independence, etc. But if they are peacefully protesting, they are peacefully making demands, I think Indonesia should be mature enough and confident enough to deal with their demands. You may not accept all their demands, but the solution is not to send the army, the police, shut them down, lock them up, muzzle them. When you start doing that, you can be sure that Syria, where are we today? It's intractable. 6 years later, the country, I would say half the country has been pushed out of its houses, either within the country or outside. 300,000 people have lost their life. About
children, basically, their futures lost.
Yeah. So, and what is happening there? Everybody has a say in what's going on. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Turkey, United States,
Syria,
except the Syrians. The ordinary Syrians are crushed. So, but why have we allowed this to go on? I mean, because what happens is that initially when these problems start, we neglect it. And it's almost always the case that the beginning, the early warning signs of trouble is human rights violations. If you take a country like Burundi now, where things are starting to brew, or DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, or Duterte in the case of Philippines, when you start violating people's human rights, we are calling what Duterte is doing is not a war on drugs, it's a war on poor people. Because who are the people behind the drug trade? There are some very rich and powerful people. Has even one of the people who have been assassinated, extrajudicially executed, are there people who are behind the drug trade? No, they are poor people on the front line. And now he has suddenly realized that the problem is with the police. So, and now what happens? He's already killed more than 3,000 people, and he says he got the diagnosis wrong.
Is it too late now to, help the people of Syria, to help the Rohingyas?
No. We are never going to stop, because Amnesty's job is to call for action, to demand accountability. So in the case of Rohingya, it's the same. We are calling on that. First and foremost, the responsibility is with the Myanmar government. They have to take responsibility for what's happening. But yes, Bangladesh has a key role. We are calling for independent investigation. An international investigation has to happen. What they have done so far is good. There's some fact finding, etc. But it's simply not adequate. But also, the governments in the region. I mentioned Indonesia, but also others, Thailand, etc., should play a much more vocal role. So yeah, we're not giving up on any of this. Amnesty is here to fight. We have the iconic emblem of Amnesty is this symbol is of a candle with the barbed wires. But the candle is very important because essentially what it said, the founder said was, you have two options. You either curse the darkness or you light a candle. So we light a candle, we shine the light, we don't give up.
Well, good luck, Salil.
Thank you.
And we'll welcome the new Indonesia office of the Amnesty International. And I hope it will continue to do good works.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Ya, demikian Insight kali ini bersama Salil Shetty, Sekjen dari Amnesty International. Demikian Insight untuk kali ini. Terima kasih atas perhatian Anda. Sampai jumpa dan